Welcome, all of you, to these 1-minute future sessions. This is one of the many events during the Digital Dutch Design Week. And in this session, we will take you on an experimental healthcare journey. And I'm very much looking forward to have a very lively discussion with you, because the things that we will present to you will be quite challenging. So we really hope you will engage in discussion using the chat room. Well, this session is organized by Kolkman, who is an experimental designer in the Netherlands, together with Reon Brand, who is the design principal of Philips Experience Design. And they both will introduce you to, on one hand, an experimental research framework and design provocations that are used to discuss the future of health. So I'm very curious what you think of these provocations and how they resonate with you. And in order to do so, I will first call forward Reon Brand to give you a proper introduction, and then we'll showcase the videos. So Reon, hello, welcome. And
Hello,
Frank,
thank
hello,
you.
welcome
Thanks,
as
Danielle.
well.
Hello, everybody.
Hey,
Good
hey.
to see you.
Reon, I would like to ask you to kick off this session with a research framework that you designed within Philips. It shows possible healthcare futures, and this model was used by Frank Kolkman and his ArtEZ students to design provocations. And I think it's very inspiring to hear more about that research framework. And it's, I think, also needed in order to understand the provocations a bit better. So I'll give the floor to you, Reon.
Thank you very much, Danielle. So let me just, is that slide presentation on? Yes.
It's
so
on
this
right.
study, I work at Philips Experience Design. And just to contextualize this study, this is a bit of an agnostic futures exploration that we've done at Philips Experience Design, with a view. This is not to be confused with the Philips strategy. And this exploration was looking at streams of future change that can be input for discussion and reflection for any company or for a government stakeholder or for even private individuals. And so this is a study that we do for reflecting also of how we will actually act in the future in bringing design forward and changing the way that we think about design. So just now I'm going to try to take you only through the key framework of the study. I cannot really do justice to the study because it's very rich, but the study started with a background of an earlier study that we've done in 2010 that I've done together with Simona Rocchi, also Philips Experience Design. And we were looking at socioeconomic paradigms of change, how that is sort of like reshaped the world. And we've seen that, the world has gone through these different paradigms of socioeconomic change and value creation over time. The agricultural age gave way for the industrial age when people moved to cities to modernize their lives and increase their standard of living. And that also led to some loss of identity for people living in density environments. And the experience economy kicked in as a value driver. And it was offering aspirational lifestyles for people. And people were almost like outsourcing their identity by adopting an aspirational lifestyle. And this was the birth of these global big brands driving lifestyle propositions. And people were paying a premium for that. And then we had the emergence around the turn of the millennium of the knowledge age, where the internet became interactive. And we had the notion of a value network starting to develop, because people could actually not only consume value, but start to create and exchange their own value online. And we have been also engaging in the transformation economy that is emerging. And this is where companies and governments and other stakeholders take ownership of key issues and team up to address things like, for example, poverty or environmental issues or access to healthcare, etc. Now, in starting this new study, we had to reflect what would be the next steps in terms of making sense of the future. And we have to recognize that the world has really changed. And for the last 10,000 years, we have lived in a geological epoch called the Holocene. And it's been a very benign 10,000 years that enabled civilizations to flourish, enabled all the development and the progress that we have seen. But we are actually turning to a new chapter now, because in this pursuit of progress, technological progress, material wealth, we have managed to start to change the geology and also the atmosphere of the Earth. And we are now seeing a period before us, and we're entering a period of uncertainty where we are faced with global warming, climate change, environmental decline. We can see, the impact on ecosystems, and there's a really poor global collaboration and governance. We have the example of America abandoning the Paris Climate Accord, and it has serious consequences for eventually global civilizations and for life on Earth as we know it. So this is a period where we have to really start to reflect and make sense of the future in a different way. So I was keen to understand, as we move into the future, what are the beliefs and the drivers that is driving us forward? Where does this come from? And how do we make sense of the future, not only through the perspective of humans and humanity? Because in this whole development up to now, it was pretty much driven by modernism, by the desire for progress, and not so much taking into account the impact on the environment. So we have to also look from really the perspective of the environment as we move forward. Now, it seems that we are heading for a temperature increase, a global climate temperature increase of more than 2 degrees centigrade in the coming decades, which is devastating if you consider that the images that I show here reflects the world today with a 1 degree change in the climate temperature over the last 100 years. And much of that 1 degree has actually happened in the last 25 to 30 years, because this warming is accelerating and is leading to devastating loss of ecosystems. You can see, for example, in the Great Barrier Reef in Australia, 80% of bleaching, and this is an area that hosts like 25% of the ocean species. We see constant sort of like fires in summers that are becoming warmer and warmer, floodings, etc. And as ecosystems are being compromised, we see actually diseases like the coronavirus that we are experiencing now that basically spill into human societies. So this is why when we reflect and see where are we going forward now, we see what is the response, to these changes that we are seeing. The first thing that we are seeing is not just sort of like any more a linear progress based on sort of like materialism. Obviously, that is still there, and there's a lot of people that are still very invested, in material progress. But there's a fragmentation of mindsets and beliefs that basically is sending the future into 4 key streams of change in the as we move forward. And it's good for us to understand, to dive a little bit into this model, to understand what is driving this. Now, as I've mentioned, most of the progress so far has been thoroughly rooted into modernism, and this is basically leveraging material science to create a better world for humanity. But increasingly, this is has been giving way to philosophy of postmodernism, which has started to emerge around the 1960s, 1970s, whereby people started to reject the narrative and the notion that there's only one truth based on logic and reason, but that we have to make way for different views of the truth based on personal experience, based on cultural experience, and based on emotion, and not only focusing on accepting facts that are based on logic and reason. Now, this is actually the knowledge age brought a platform where these different ideas and different views of the future also started to proliferate. And what we see today is that the way also that search engines work is search engines tend to give you more of what you already know and what you already like. So you get these bubbles of self-confirmation where people are trapped into their own beliefs that are really fragmenting as we are moving forward. And we are today living in what we call the post-fact or the post-truth society, whereby there's less and less room for debate, and people are so convinced in these different bubbles that their view is right that it is really fragmenting. So in order to respond to the changes that we see in the world and moving forward, the first split is a split that I call into two directions. In the direction I called transmutation, and that is an augmentative mindset. And that means that we believe that technology can help us to make ourselves stronger, to augment our capabilities, and that we will be resilient irrespective of what happens in nature. The other direction, in the direction of transformation, is a preventative mindset. And it means that we have to think what we can do to coexist in a better way with nature and prevent this collapse of ecosystems from accelerating and from happening in the first place. So let us now go and dive a little bit into these different trajectories to make sense of them. Now, I'm first going to the top of this model. The two trajectories you see here are Etheria and Immortalia, and I will explain them now because these are metaphor names that I've given to them. And let's first look at the bottom one called Immortalia, because that is probably the one that is most easy to recognize. And that is in a world where, especially in the developed world, where religious belief in the afterlife is declining, many people are relying more on cutting-edge science to make us smarter, to make us more competitive, and to make us live longer in the future. So this is thoroughly rooted, this belief in reason and logic that you can trace back to the ancient Greek philosophers, Plato and Aristotle, that has put a very high emphasis on reason and logic, and also they believe that this is what distinguishes us as human beings from nature. The Christianity also picked up on that, and basically we position man above nature. And there's a verse in Genesis where God has given mankind the right to rule over nature and basically use it as a resource. And if you look at sort of like Enlightenment science that flourished in the 1700s, Francis Bacon, he had a viewpoint that with science we will conquer nature and we will bend it to our will. And that is pretty much the trajectory of science, because we've seen the world as increasingly through like a reductionist approach and a material approach, that everything consists of matter that we can break down in smaller and smaller particles to understand it, and we can reconfigure the world and bend it to our will and create the world that we want and create a kind of a preferable future that humanity wants. And this has been the trajectory that we've been pursuing since that time. Now, and especially I think, if you look at like classical Newtonian material science, there's an increasing sort of like view of seeing nature as an integrate machine with particles that we can really then reconfigure as we move forward. Now, the key quest for this and the key drivers pushing this forward is that we are seeing ourselves progressing through technology on top of nature. We want to live forever. We want to be smarter. We want to be more healthy. And we believe that technology can give this to us. If we just look at examples today, it's quite clear that clearly demonstrate the power of modern science. We increasingly see the merging with technologies like computer brain interfaces that are maturing and that are advancing, whereby in the near future we may be able to link our brains directly to artificial intelligence systems that will dramatically increase our access to information and our memory absolutely on the fly. We see the development of stem cell technology that allows us to develop and bioprint organ replacements for ourselves based on our own cells in the future. There's an incredible progress and work going into this direction. And then there is obviously the technique that many of you have heard of, CRISPR, whereby we can design single genes, and we can basically start to change genetics of humans. Obviously, there's a lot of power for modifying and for curing certain diseases, but it is a matter of time before that allows us to actually design the genetic future of humanity and start to actually look for designer babies with the traits that we want for the future, which is obviously very dangerous. Because the thing is, we understand the functions of single genes, but you always have to contextualize how those genes behave in a bigger system. And often we cannot predict, if we change something generations down the line, what may be the impact. The other aspect about this trajectory is that all this incredible technology is only available really for a wealthy few people that may end up becoming a super species. And this is why we call it superhuman and transhuman, because as we start to actually get access to this empowering technologies, it will not be available for all the 9 billion people in the world today. And there's a great danger that the inequalities that we are seeing today will dramatically increase because of this. And if we look at the meaning for health, obviously, you know, there's this drive towards making some of these technologies more accessible to the masses. But you know, the fact that we, in essence, seeing the human body as a machine that we can tweak makes it such that we have a very kind of like a narrow view. We set very narrow goals, and we have, in essence, an overestimation of our capabilities and an underestimation of the potential systemic consequences where this can lead us as humanity. I will now quickly discuss Etheria. Etheria is different insofar as it's a future that values the purity of advancing human intelligence and sentience. And we have come to a point where we start to see the limitations of the human biological form. For example, Ray Kurzweil coined the term called the singularity, which means there's a point that computers will be smarter than human beings. So they will not need human beings to develop technology. They will develop themselves, these artificial intelligence algorithms. And at that point, there will be an exponential a gap opening up between the intelligence of humans and the intelligence of this. You can almost call it a new life form of intelligence. And there's a number of a rising number of humans that believe that we have to, in the future, give up the biological form if we want to keep up. Otherwise, we run the risk of becoming a lesser species. So there's a number of groups working on understanding, on mapping the human brain. And there's, for example, I think there's 3 or 4 big projects in the world. One of them is the European Brain Project in Dresden, that is working on a substrate-independent mind, and they are using advanced techniques of nano probes into a human brain that can crack tens of thousands of neuron reactions and make sense of them and simulate that into a supercomputer. And eventually, they hope to actually create a supercomputer that functions as a human brain. So the thing that we have to question here is that we are again making the assumption that the human is working like a machine, and we have in all of these developments, we have like the hardware software metaphor of computers in mind moving this forward. But consciousness is a very, very difficult problem to get our grip on, because in essence, we don't know what consciousness is. There are a lot of different theories about consciousness, and I think the one that is really gaining ground is the consciousness theory of panpsychism, which means that consciousness is not only existing in the brain, it's existing in the entire human body, but beyond that, because of connectedness of electromagnetic fields in quantum theory. You get this entanglement, and consciousness is probably extending into the entire universe, and there's levels of consciousness everywhere in the universe. So that makes it very difficult to actually neatly take the human brain and turn it into a machine. And with this drive, obviously, there's a big focus on mental health, neurostimulation, and cognitive enhancement of human beings, because we have to prepare ourselves if we want to eventually upload our brain into a computer system, that our brain is in a healthy and the best state to actually get access to this constant development. It also, as a direction, offers other interesting, plausible possibilities. For example, space travel with a human being, if you have to travel for 100,000 years, is impossible. But if you have an intelligence that exists in a different format, that becomes completely possible. So that is what is driving these two directions. I want to now move over to the next two directions, and that here we go to the preventative mindset of transformation. And again, this splits into the two directions. The one into the direction of sustainability, steady state. And this is a direction that is focused on resource centrism. And it is the aim of Habitania, of the metaphor of Habitania, is to maintain human prosperity and quality of life, but with a recognition of planetary boundaries and safe spaces for nature by better management of our resources. In a way, it is more egalitarian than the previous one of the trajectory of Immortalia, because it is not only for wealthy individuals, but here there's more cooperation, and there's really an aim to reduce inequalities and cooperate more in society to achieve some of these goals. And this is driven by a number of key efforts, to measurable goals to reduce waste, to limit carbon dioxide. We can think of things like, for example, circular economy, where we try to prevent waste spilling over into the environment and start to develop sort of like circular methods of designing. And we have big initiatives of the United Nations, like the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, we have to, in the end, also ask ourselves if these initiatives will really be sufficient to achieve these goals of really saving the planet, creating prosperity for all human beings with safe spaces to nature. And if we look at the reality, it seems a little bit unlikely. And the reason I'm saying that is that the stunning loss of habitat we have seen in the last 100 years. We know now that 100 years ago, 15% of the planet was heavily dominated by the human footprint, and 85% was effectively wild. Now there's only 20% of wild space, and a lot of that is not even protected. And much of that is in areas that are deserts on Antarctica, etc. And it means this implosion of ecosystems that we are seeing. 60% of mammals have been wiped out in the last 40 years, and it's accelerating. We do not have sufficient intact ecosystems to say these are sort of like the safe spaces for nature, because those, even if we completely go to circular economy and recycling today at the best levels that we can, we will continue to still see a decline in natural systems, because circular economy does not address the damage that has been done to the planet in the last 100 years. And we see now that we already have entered the sixth great extinction that the planet has seen. And the difference is that this extinction has been brought about by human activity. It's the first time in the history of the planet that one species is catalyzing a new geological epoch and is catalyzing a potential a collapse of all ecosystems. And so with sustainability, we have to ask ourselves, like, what are we trying to sustain? because if we are in this in a world, in a globe that is really damaged and that is in a spiral of decline, it is not sufficient to just recycle and create a circular economy. It does not mean that the circular economy is not important. I think, if you are speeding towards with your car to go over a very deep cliff, obviously you're going to apply the brakes, and that is what circular economy can do. It applies the brakes, it slows us down, but eventually you still have to think of changing direction, because otherwise you will just proceed to go over the cliff. So this is, I think, a moment to really reflect, and as a first step, circular economy and many of these initiatives are important, but we should not give ourselves the illusion that this is what will actually save us in the end. We need to go far beyond that, and we have to think about how would we regenerate nature, and what is it that we need to do to make that happen. So if we think what it means for health, also there's a lot of focus now, because of like the inequality in the world, on access to health, giving more people access, but in a way it does not really adequately address the root causes of ill health. And we see today healthcare systems all over the world are under increasing strain. There's a high level of burnout amongst healthcare providers, and the rising unemployment brought by, for example, the COVID epidemic. Many companies, many of those jobs will not come back, because companies have used this as an opportunity to actually invest in automation. So many of those jobs will not return. So the inequality divide will actually be widened, and it will actually make access to healthcare more difficult to achieve, even with leapfrogging technologies that sort of like can help us to improve access to health. We have to really reflect on what is the way forward. And affordable healthcare for us may remain like a mirage on the horizon if we are not able to keep people from getting sick in the first place. Now, let us look at Gaia. Gaia is very different from the threat of sustainability, because sustainability is still is looking at scarcities, whereas regeneration sees the planet as a planet of abundance, but with a difference of that we can only achieve that if we abandon our desire for material progress. And we see the world in a very different way, and from a very different perspective. And it requires basically a change of heart and falling in love with nature to make this change towards the Gaia trajectory. Now, the Gaia metaphor was inspired obviously by the ancient Greek goddess of Gaia, who was the mother of the earth in Greek mythology, but also the book by the same name by James Lovelock and Lynn Margulis, that wrote a fascinating book called Gaia, that showed how the planetary systems between species and life on Earth and the geology of the Earth is completely interacting, and that actually life on Earth and the interaction with the planet is what makes our planet livable. And it makes us realize that we cannot just look at individual species or saving individual species, or even at biodiversity. We have to look at connected biodiversity and geobiodiversity. So that means like biodiverse systems that is linked to the local geology, and all of these systems are eventually interconnected across the planet. And unless we create a healthy planet, it is very, very difficult to guarantee a healthy life for ourselves. And this has been inspired by many influences, because increasingly we start, the ancient Asian sages, like in the Tao philosophy, have always had never put humans on top of nature. They had the saying of Wu Wei, which means staying in the flow of nature. And this is the great challenge that we have. We are the only species that create waste that no other species can use. And increasingly, the way that we design, the way that we pursue progress of technology, we are creating an incredible amount of toxic waste that accumulates, that is detrimental for our own health, for the environment at large, and is driving forward this sort of collapse of ecosystems that is needed for our own sustenance. So as we move forward with starting to understand what is the possible impact of Gaia, it means that we have to take the step to rekindle our connection with nature, and we will have to start to design in a very different way. And we will, instead of advancing, progress in materials that are toxic, so in our living environments today, there's 100,000 chemical substances in our living environments today. In modern environments, it was not there 100 years ago. And all of these things start to compromise our health. And the important thing is that if we start to take a critical look at what is a human being, we consist of more bacterial cells than human cells. We are about 60% bacterial cells, our bodies, and 40% human cells. And there's an incredible sort of like interaction. Our entire immune system is reliant on a healthy microbiome in our bodies. And this environment that we are living in is with full of pesticides and other harmful chemicals, is compromising our immune systems. And you can see that clearly if you look in advanced developed societies. You have a much higher incidence of things like Alzheimer's, cancer, Crohn's disease, childhood leukemia. All of these diseases are much more prevalent in our advanced societies because of the environments that we have created through technological progress. So if we start to see ourselves as an ecosystem that is connected to a bigger ecosystem, we realize that we cannot put ourselves on top of nature anymore. We should start to see ourselves as just another species, and that the earth is our host. So we have to ask ourselves, how will we approach healthcare, and how will we approach design differently in such a situation? It means that we cannot try to fulfill every customer desire anymore. It means that we cannot only be customer-centric and customer-focused, but we have to focus on the value and the health of natural systems around us. That has to be a key driver of how we design and how we approach also health. And approaching our health as living a healthy life in a healthy ecosystem makes us resilient, because a healthy ecosystem with high biodiversity is much more health resilient and much less likely to succumb to disease than if your microbiome and your immunity is compromised. And this is, for me, a sensible view of addressing the health problem that we are seeing of healthcare that is becoming increasingly burdened and unaffordable. And in our current world, still, it's very difficult. It's relatively easy, depending on where you are in the world, to get diagnosed and to get treatments. But it's still very difficult to understand what you have to do to live a healthy life in harmony with nature. So these are the things that we have to address. I think I'm going to stop at this point, because otherwise we take too much time.
Though it's tremendously interesting. Thanks a lot, Reon. It was lovely hearing you. I know the model by heart now, but every time you talk about it, it becomes so valuable to discuss all these things, especially since you bring economic developments, social developments, even mental developments into play, and that all into one simple model. But maybe to clarify, this is not a model that you use to predict the future. It's more a model to discuss possible consequences. How are you using this within Philips?
Like I said in the beginning, I think we should not confuse this with a strategy for a company. This is an agnostic model. It's looking at streams of change that have beliefs and a lot of investment behind them that are causing so all of these streams of change are actually unfolding in parallel, and they may even interact with one another. You can make scenarios how that will actually pan out in the future, but it's for me a framework for reflection. So I think any company or a government or anybody can take this model and think, okay, what is it that we're pursuing? Where do we see this back in the model? And is this really, the future direction that really resonates with us? What is it that we have to do? So it's a model for discussion and reflection and a model for experimentation. And this is also what brought us to this collaboration with universities and students, to explore how do we take this model and make it a little bit more tangible for discussion.
That's a perfect bridge to Frank, indeed. Thanks a lot, Reon. We will be discussing this model a bit further during the session. And please do interact. You can put your questions or concerns, because I think some of the models are pretty terrifying. So please do put your concerns and questions in the comment section so we can bring in your questions in this discussion. That brings us to you, Frank, because you use this model as a starting point for design provocations that your students at ArtEZ designed. And we will be looking at the videos in a minute. But perhaps you can explain us a bit how you started this in the first place. Why bringing this model into play and why design?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks, Danielle. I will actually I will start with a more like a high-level introduction, I guess, about how we use the model as a starting point to collaborate with actually various schools. So this year we collaborated with students from ArtEZ, but in the past 3 years we've actually collaborated also with the Design Academy Eindhoven and the Technical University in Eindhoven. So this is like an ongoing process, and works that were created in the past few years are actually feeding into the work that is being done this year and perhaps the work that will follow. Maybe let me try if I can switch on. Yeah, there we go. So I hope that you can see my screen now. Perfect. Yeah, so I'm going to talk a little bit about like how we've been working these past 3 years together with these students. And I guess the important thing to mention here is that the goal has been to, in a way, sort of test the application of the model that Reon just presented, but at the same time also question it and perhaps even advance the thinking. Like it's always a challenge for the students to sort of like create something that also sort of throws off Reon perhaps and sort of like allows different perspectives on the model to originate. So another thing to that is that on the paper, the model of course looks quite neat with like fairly cleanly separated streams. But of course, as soon as you start to move to practical reality, things might play out to be a lot more messy. There might be a lot more overlap. Things can intertwine and sort of pan out in slightly different ways. So that's also part of getting that to the foreground. And another thing is that, as Reon already mentioned, the model is quite rich, which also means that it can be quite dense. And by making tangible outcomes on top of it, hopefully we allow a discussion to take place that is a bit more accessible. So that's sort of the plan. Let me see if I can advance the slide. Yeah. So a methodology that we've used to try and do this is a methodology that is referred to as design probes. And design probes are essentially design visions of possible futures that mix science, design, and storytelling. So it's a way to create fictional objects that allow people to engage with different views. So especially the different views that are represented through the model as well. And as Reon already said before, also, these are not intended as predictions, but much more as a means to present parallel visions and to trigger us to more critically reflect on our desires and ambitions for the future. So it also means that some of the outcomes might be negative, some might be positive, some might sort of be more like cautionary tales that warn us for certain parts of these future streams, or others might be very optimistic and very positive about adopting certain things. But then this is sort of a roadmap of how we use the model. So of course the model was the starting point, but then it was part of my responsibility to turn this into a briefing that, or various briefings actually, that allowed students to then engage with it. So in order to do that, we created these sort of booklets or briefing booklets that were almost similar to sort of small science fiction novels, in which we actually did two things. So at the first hand, we zoomed out. So we actually included a lot of the original sources that fed into the model that basically triggered Reon's thinking to begin with. So research that is taking place, certain social evolutions or systems like that. But on the other hand, we also zoomed in very much. So on a very detailed level, we wrote these sort of short stories, like almost like miniature narratives about a day in the life, that enabled students to then engage with what this future might look like or what it might feel like on a day-to-day basis. Then we asked them to actually create probes based on the briefing of imagining healthcare applications within this future. So these narratives that I just described were not so much dealing with healthcare yet. They were much more, they gave a much more general approach. And then their briefing was really to engage with, okay, what might health or an approach to health look like in this future? They created that into sort of tangible products or services that then got presented as a means of provocation to engage with an audience. And then through that engagement, we actually attempt to generate future insights. So we basically try to capture sentiment. So how do people feel or think about these futures or about these specific applications? Now, of course, the goal of all this is to stimulate debate, as I already mentioned, but also to reveal how these imageries resonate with a larger audience. But of course, the real goal behind that is to we want to move forward innovation perspectives and transform decision-making today. So by that, I mean that if you're plotting a trajectory towards the future or you're creating strategies for a company, it's nice to know which directions are actually available to you so that you can decide like which one of those is actually, in your opinion, the most preferable direction to take. So it also means that you have to map out perhaps the negatives. Then to do that, for the first iteration of this project in 2018, we collaborated with the Design Academy Eindhoven and the TU Eindhoven, so the Technical University, and we teamed them up together. So we created mixed groups, and we wanted to create a sort of make these future streams, all four of them comparable. So we created 4 teams that each would sort of investigate a healthcare application within each of the streams, and that resulted in these 4 probes. So as you can tell by the color in the background, these are each representative of one of the streams. I don't think we have time to go into them into too much detail, but they each sort of enable a discussion whereby the different visions on healthcare, how they were represented. So for example, on the far left, we see a proposed baby monitor that would exist in Etheria, where the focus would really be on brain development and sort of cognitive development. Whereas on the extreme right, we see a sort of an apparatus that would allow diagnosis to take place for the whole ecosystem. So not just humans, but also plants and animals within it by using a means of smell. So by presenting them alongside each other, you could actually make these comparisons and sort of align with some of the values. The problem with that was, and I guess this was also the main insight from that year, is that we found that as soon as we started to engage with the audience, that the audience would assume that the top 2 streams of the model, so Etheria and Immortalia, would also be the most technological. And in our opinion, that was definitely not the case. So there's actually something interesting going on, because technologies, but also artifacts, can actually cross-transverse all over these 4 streams. So artificial intelligence, for example, might play a role in the bottom 2 or in the top 2 streams, as it seems the most obvious, but it also can play a role in the bottom 2 streams. So this is exactly what we wanted to explore for the second iteration, whereby we asked, again, student teams from the Design Academy Eindhoven and the TU in Eindhoven to explore the bottom 2 streams in more detail, but focus specifically on digital technologies like robotics and artificial intelligence and what roles they could play within these streams. So again, we created 4 probes, but in this case, 2 of them were positioned in Habitania and 2 of them were positioned in Gaia. Again, also, I probably don't have time to go into them in too much detail, but some of them will come back later. And then, of course, this year, things were a bit different because of the Corona situation. Of course, it became unfeasible for us to have a long sort of prototyping session where students would make physical things. Also, because the Dutch Design Week became fully virtual, as we are now fully experiencing, we had to change our approach slightly. And what we decided to do was actually, instead of coming up with a new set of probes, we actually thought it was an interesting idea to revisit a couple of previously created probes and have another student team, in this case students from ArtEZ, reflect on them. So not to create the next iteration or to make them more pretty or to sort of make them more fleshed out, but they really with the goal to question a lot of the starting points and to really rethink and revisit the starting points from that probe, and to present that in the form of video in this case. So we started off that process by inviting two very influential artists and filmmakers, Noam Turan and Joseph Popper, to give a lecture on their practice, but also to because these were mostly product design and design art technology students, to also that are not necessarily accustomed to working with film, but to also give them sort of an insight or an overview about how, as a designer, you can work with film and what role objects and artifacts can play within film. So that was very inspiring, and I think it influenced the outcome very much. And then after this, we actually tasked the students to come up with a set, so a stage set essentially, made mostly out of cardboard and cheap and accessible materials, in which they could play out a scenario inspired by one of the previous probes. So in slightly under 4 weeks, we had 4 teams creating 4 sets that would then have to be filmed in just 1 day. So we had for each of the teams had a film studio for 1 day, in which they then got together and they shot a sort of small movie. And the limitation for that was that we only gave them 1 minute. So the working title for this was actually 1 Minute Futures. So the challenge was to actually sort of basically present this scenario as if it could be played out in one of these future streams based on one of these previous probes in 1 minute, and then really try to highlight sort of the frictions and the sort of perhaps discrepancies that would be prevalent in this future. And I'm obviously quite proud of the results. I think the teams did quite well. And I think this is also a good example of how you see that, but perhaps this will become more clear as soon as we start to discuss it in more detail, but that these are not as neat as the model. There's a lot of overlap between worlds, and actually it also shows that in some ways we as designers still lack some of the methodologies to really engage with the clean future streams. But perhaps let's not talk about it more. Let's first look at some of the examples. So I guess the first video I'd like to show is a video called Prime Cycle, and this would be positioned within the stream of Immortalia or Etheria, and it's about a future where digital technologies play a very large role, and whereby a cognitive enhancement already starts very soon after everyone's born. So let's go have a look.
Oh, as a parent, this scares the hell out of me. Imagining, because if I understand it correctly, this is a cradle that produces audiovisual stimuli that can already stimulate the brain.
Yeah, I guess the starting point was this idea that, if brain health becomes very important in the future, because we have the proposition that perhaps brain uploading might become a thing in a lifetime for your child. It's of course crucial that their cognitive abilities would allow such a thing to take place. So if you want the best for your child, you might want to invest in the technologies that sort of like stimulate that ability or that potential. And of course there is like this sort of like I guess the duality in this is like, what do you want for your child? Like, is it something, do you trust your own sort of more natural instincts, or like do you trust in this technology to do the best thing? And the idea would be that you could have like an artificial intelligence actually monitoring how the brain development is going, and these audiovisual cues could be targeted to actually enhance that process in a very precise and targeted way.
If I bring this back to your model, Reon, this would fit perhaps the Immortalia, but also the Ethereum paradigm, I guess, or a bit in between. Where would you fit it in?
Yeah, like Frank said, probably a little bit in between, but I think we had that discussion before, because Etheria, if you imagine that we abandon the biological form, once you've taken that step, no materiality matters, biology doesn't matter, you don't need biology. So it's very, very difficult to even imagine what such a future may be like. The only part that we could sort of like imagine and engage with was, how would we prepare ourselves in the event that such technology becomes available to humanity and it becomes a possibility. And it brings back a lot of, like, I think, ideas for reflection. I mentioned earlier, the notion of using CRISPR with gene therapy to make designer babies. Because in the end, there's this kind of like inherent deterministic drive that we have as humans that have become almost like addicted to the idea of like progress. And, shaping your infant before he or she has any say in their own development is typical. That's kind of like helicopter parenting, that desire the best for your child, but you cannot really predict if that's necessarily the best for the child. So it's like this ambiguity that we are dealing with, and I think the movie is in for me fantastic, because in one way it suggests the possibility of like really taking us to another level of development, but it also raises all these sort of like questions, and this is exactly the kind of, I think, discussion we would like to have.
Yeah, I guess what you mentioned is also, it's perhaps questions this feasibility, the idea that we can create almost everything according to our own preferences and needs. These designer babies are actually, becoming to life by means of this video. So what were the discussions amongst the students, Frank, creating this video?
Well, I guess the thing to question is sort of like this. Of course, it's an exaggeration because it's an extrapolation, right? Like we position it in the future because it allows us to exaggerate these ideas. But if you really think about sort of healthcare technology today, if you look at especially baby products, like they become increasingly capable of monitoring all kinds of metrics. Like from before we might
sleep
have
patterns,
exactly, sleep patterns, heartbeat. Temperature. So we like to have this idea that, if we know more metrics, that we have more control. And I guess if you think about like a desire for parents, especially, I guess new parents, I'm not a parent yet, but I've seen it in my surroundings, that there's like, it's terrifying to have kids. So to an extent, so to actually sort of like, if you could supply people with this sort of sense of control, this sense of structure, that is very desirable. And I guess it comes also back to what Reon was saying. You want the best for your child, so you want to give them the best chances at a healthy and successful lifestyle. So if technology like this would be available, you could also consider it immoral not to use it. So there's like this very interesting discussion that starts to take place.
Because I think
sorry, Reon, because I think this is the intention, right? To bring these discussions and make them very tangible by means of these scenarios played out. And I think the question whether it's a desirable future, whether this is something that perhaps Philips has to produce, is what interests you, I guess, Reon.
Absolutely, because the thing is, one discussion is also like, I think the intention of the parents are always good. we assume, because, they want the best for their child. But, in this case, obviously, they are conditioned by the current social milieu in which children thrive through competition, through being better than the next person to get the best life. If we move towards a future of cooperation, or a future towards connecting with nature, you may actually inadvertently make your child kind of autistic for that environment, because you're giving him from the start the wrong skills. So these are very interesting discussions to have.
Yeah, exactly. You presented, Frank, at the start that this was a kind of a relay race that started with probes designed by Design Academy students and TUE students, and then the ArtEZ students took over, or brought it to the next level, you could say. Did this project start with the baby monitor you showed us in your slides?
Yeah, so I showed the baby monitor with the head cap, which had the sort of the small elements on top. That was more or less a prototype, more for like an EEG style apparatus that would recognize those patterns in that way. And I guess this team really wanted to take it, make it, I guess, less technological and less distant, and make it more visual. I think this team this year really zoomed in on how cognitive development works. And like one of the things that they've discovered is that actually, if you're a baby, some of the early things that you need is actually just to learn to recognize shapes, learn to recognize sounds, recognizing patterns, colors. Actually, if a baby is born, they don't even see further than like 6 centimeters. So this is also, I guess, what drove them to sort of imagine that this thing would have to slide quite close to baby's face to actually be able to sort of experience this. But they also wanted to bring out, especially this idea that where the previous baby monitor was much more sort of giving advice to parents on what to do, this was more like a sort of a more of a closed solution, I guess, that would sort of administer that feedback more directly. Yeah, basically they also imagine this to be like for the baby, like this could turn into like a full LSD style trip. Like it's really hard to.
So the question is more, would the baby like this?
Yeah, well, that's the question, of course. Yeah, I mean, it's like from the parent's perspective, it's easy to imagine, well, I'm doing the best for my child, but what the perspective of the baby is, it's really hard to engage with, actually.
Okay, well, I think it's also time to move to the next video. It's titled Common Health, and I think I'll explain it afterwards, because that will give us a more open perspective on what students created. So if you could play the... So I guess this is the new way of doing exercises. If I've seen it correctly, it's a swimming pool, and it's using technology to do exercises, and meanwhile also, well, getting a sort of relief for the healthcare system, because we don't need to rely on the system anymore. We rely on the technology. Is that correct, Frank?
Yeah, I guess it's sort of a reflection on sort of like what our perception of healthiness or fitness is currently. I guess there's this idea that, you know, if you want to be healthy, then you should practice fitness and to stay fit and to prevent, you know, from developing diseases. But the question this video is really asking is like, what if that becomes like more of a societal or a communal goal? So what if companies or the society at large would start to almost expect this out of every individual? So we already see this happening. There are companies already that require their employees to practice sort of certain fitness tasks, you know, as a means to increase productivity or a means to increase sort of healthiness of staff. And the question is really like, what if this would be completely monitored by technology, and this wouldn't really be sort of an opt-out scenario? So in this film, I guess the students took it to the point where the workspaces or living spaces started to merge with sort of the swimming pool environment, I guess.
Yeah, it's a workspace that I didn't get, but the idea of a common health, where would that fit in, Reon? In what paradigm would you?
Well, I think if we look at the Habitania trajectory, the trajectory of steady state and sustainability, it fits very well there, because I think it relies a lot to achieve sustainability goals. You cannot do that without social cooperation. And to get to the level of social cooperation that will really make a difference, probably there has to be some top-down pressure. And you see that, you know, increasingly in the world, there's like a proliferation of surveillance technology. You see already China has this sort of like digital credit system whereby every action that you are doing online or even physically is being monitored, and you get a point system that allows you certain benefits in society or not. You know, and as we know, also China is more and more influential in the world. So we can imagine, you know, in order to achieve some of these sustainability goals, there may be eventually some top-down coercion to actually enforce certain social behavior. And I think this movie does a great job of bringing forward sort of like those elements for discussion, because I think this is quite interesting for us to reflect on that.
So if I understand you correctly, the sort of top-down strategy would then be the technology in this case, the technology actually requiring the community to do exercises, and this idea of commoning or the sort of social structure behind it is enforced upon by the technology, right? And is that, because you refer to China, Reon, is that a model that you see is, well, something that we should already take action against, or should we do something about this?
It's something we should deeply reflect on, because I think since the Enlightenment, we've been on this trajectory of increased personal freedom, individual freedom, hyper-personalization. But now, in terms of the environment, we're starting to hit a brick wall, and we have to ask ourselves, like, can we afford this level of hyper-personalization and for everybody? And the answer is definitely no. You know, so how do we deal with this? You know, can we suddenly expect society to be 100% cooperative? Probably not. So what are the avenues to do this? You know, and you can imagine a certain level of also top-down enforcement. For example, if we think access to care is really important, but you know, we have a limitation of resources, we have a limitation of doctors, there will be more pressure for people to make an effort from their side to stay healthy. Also, if we think through automation, people will lose their jobs, so they cannot contribute so much to the healthcare system. So how do you do this? So I think this movie for me is very provocative, because it raises that question, is that in order to pursue this path of sustainability, are we willing to give up some of those freedoms and be patronized by the government to actually engage in a certain behavior?
Yeah. Though if I look at it, Frank, it also looks actually pretty comfortable up there. You don't need to do the silly exercises. You can just go in the machine and you get fit immediately. I guess that was intentionally done that way, right? It feels quite comfortable in a way.
I guess we don't get to see the full swimming pool, so I still imagine that the swimming will take place like behind the scenes still. But the thing is, like, this idea of sort of social coercion, like, it can be quite subtle. So I think it's also a reflection on this idea of sort of nudging. So where technology is basically nudging you into a certain type of behavior. So it basically means that there is someone that has an agenda, whether it be, sort of like politically driven or sort of technically driven, or, a company. But that's like through means of sort of like labeling something as very desirable, like tries to lure people into doing it, into buying into this philosophy. So I would imagine that, sorry?
It works for me.
Sign me up.
Yeah, exactly. So I guess it works for a lot of people, I think. Like, if you think about Instagram today and sort of like influencer marketing, like there's already this idea that a lot of people buy into this idea of like fitness and being healthy and sort of looking good. And so that can be quite persuasive. So it doesn't have to feel very restrictive at all. Like, with the sort of, I guess the point system in China is still very obvious. Like, you get a number of stars, you get restrictions, you get limitations, or you get, additional benefits. But if that happens more and more in the background, and if, say, an artificial technology would be sufficiently advanced to not sort of allow you to see that you're part of the system, but you would get to see the benefits, and like, your body is growing, you see your muscle tone, you see like all those positive aspects, and you get like constant applause from everyone because you're working for a greater cause.
Thumbs up.
Yeah, exactly. That could be a super positive experience.
Yeah. I mean, it's what happens on the internet. Why do people kind of get addicted to social media? Because there are smart algorithms that can adapt to people and subtly coerce you into a certain kind of behavior without you even realizing it. And that is definitely, I think, and I like this sort of like spin on it. It's like different from the last time. The question still remains that if somebody is not, or if it's a large group of people is not complying, what will happen? So but I think it is. I really love the kind of like subtleness of persuasion rather than coercion that you've taken.
That's a nice way of putting it.
Yeah.
We're going to watch the third video, and before I announce it, I really would like the audience to respond to this. So please do ask questions or put some concerns in the comment section. It would be nice to see how all these videos resonate with you. The third video is immunocalibration, and I think it's a very provocative one, especially within the context of Corona. So let's have a look first, and then curious what you... Right, so with the current emphasis on hand hygiene, how should we read this video, Frank?
I guess this is basically what we saw is I guess the best way to explain it is sort of a public toilet where the protagonist tries to exit, and in order to exit, she has to scan her hands for the presence of any sort of dangerous bacteria or dangerous pathogens. And in this case, some are detected or like in harmful quantities, so she's denied access and she's told to clean her hands. But actually, the interesting thing is, this might sound very restrictive, and of course, we all know that we need to wash our hands, like when we want to exit the toilet. But the thing is, like, our approach to hygiene might be a bit overdone. So actually, because we're cleaning so much, we're also washing away a lot of the positive and essential microbes, basically microbes that we need for our bodily functions to work. So in this scenario, actually, in order to get a better or a more harmonious existence with microbes, you're only told to wash away when there are, or you're only told to wash your hands when there are harmful quantities detected. So it means that you can actually drastically reduce disinfectants use. If you don't spread bacteria via contact surfaces, it means that you can use less antibiotics. And we can decrease pesticide use, for example. So it means that actually, by being more strict about washing away, the negative ones, we can actually create a better environment for positive essential microbes. So actually, at the end of the video, we also see this shower as soon as the door is closed, which is actually the toilet, instead of being cleaned, is actually showered in essential microbes, taking a place that otherwise could be occupied by harmful pathogens or harmful microbes.
Wow. Yeah, I already mentioned in this corona pandemic, this might be seen as quite a provocation, especially I read this morning that all the antibacteria cleaning materials are sold out because everyone is so up to cleaning nowadays. How could this be brought into play? Because I feel that especially now it's becoming more and more difficult to make people aware of the good bacteria.
I think there's a level of fear now in the world, and I think over the last decades, in our fight against disease, we have as a society been conditioned to become more and more hygienic. But if we look at, for example, hunter-gatherers, in Tanzania, there's still a group of, I think it's a Hasda group, the hunter-gatherers that coexist with nature. There's been a study in their microbiome, and their microbiome is far more biodiverse than ours. They also have much higher resilience, and they are much likely to get infected. Because if you are part of this sort of like really biodiverse ecosystem and you have a rich microbiome, any kind of such ecosystem defends itself against intruders. Is if your immune system starts to go down and your diversity goes down, you become more susceptible to infection. So by over cleaning, we don't challenge our immune system, we don't train our immune system. It becomes weaker over time, and we are in this environment full of harmful chemicals. So in the end, we are immunocompromised, and because of that, we have to clean constantly to avoid any possible contact with pathogens. So I think we are in this kind of like a situation where by our behavior reinforces, our condition. And I love the idea that, by taking the possibility of benign bacteria and saturating surfaces where we operate with these bacteria, that we start to get more exposed towards bacteria that can be beneficial for our immune system and for the way that our body functions. So I think it is quite an interesting provocation, but again, socially to make it acceptable for people will be quite difficult, to bring people to the level of acceptance, probably.
There's someone in the comment section who mentioned perhaps an immunopassport. I'm not sure how to read that comment, but I could imagine he or she means that perhaps this could be something to also be very proud of, the bacteria you wear, and that you sort of use that for your identity. Frank, could you respond to that?
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question, especially in the light of, right now, if we want to fly anywhere, I think there's a lot to do at the moment about sort of like having a passport, a corona passport, essentially.
Exactly.
Which is sort of like, you need a bill of clean health in a way, like less than 72 hours ahead of time, I think, before being able to travel anywhere. I guess in this sense, you could imagine something similar. It might actually be an interesting or provoking idea to explore that a bit further. Like, could you, perhaps travel to certain regions, or would you travel to certain regions to get like immunity for particular things, or would that allow you access to
Bring
other
the good bacteria back home,
yeah,
right?
it might be a very interesting idea
Yeah.
to further explore. But I guess in this case, it's again sort of presented as this transitional phase. I mean, especially given the current corona conditions, I mean, there's a lot of shops where you don't get access unless you disinfect your hands, right? So
Yeah.
there's this idea of restricting access is very very relevant at the moment. I guess in this case, it would just be a lot more precise. So what we see happening right now is a lot of hygiene theater, where in the newspapers and in the news, we see people sort of spraying massive disinfectants throughout the streets, and, clouds of sort of antimicrobials being, but that doesn't actually help, because the biggest contamination still happens from contact surfaces, meaning your hands, food surfaces, surfaces where there is a large concentration of especially bad bacteria happening, whereas all the other stuff, all the theater, is mostly harmful for the positive bacteria. And actually, by washing them away, we create space for negative bacteria or viruses to actually take up space and create this more risk prone environment rather than risk adverse. So I think if there's a time to reflect on how we deal with hygiene, it's definitely now.
Yeah, good one. Maybe to round up this specific video, this fits within Habitania, right, Reon?
Yes, let me just think now. No, this one is more towards I think probably a little bit towards Gaia, because this is the idea that you are part of a bigger ecosystem that is helping to keep you healthy, and you accept that you're so it's bringing us more in contact with. It's a design way of almost like simulating greater contact with the natural environment. Am I correct, Frank?
Yeah, I guess I would also explain it as a very technological approach to Gaia, whereas the underlying value is very much to support sort of like essential microbes, so a micro ecosystem that we don't necessarily have a lot of contact with. So that's perhaps not very sort of a very Gaian mindset, but but the values or the underlying values are definitely to sort of protect that ecosystem and to realize that you're a part of that, I guess.
The thing is, like, if we really start to purely look from a Gaia perspective, it's more important that you are in contact and in sync with bacteria and organisms in your local ecosystem. So there's not like one batch of good bacteria that's good for everybody, and with that you are okay everywhere. So there's that nuance, and we have to reflect how to deal with that also. But I think it's, for me, an interesting provocation that you're using technology, but to actually bridge that gap that we have created between us and nature that is making us weaker. So I would position it more towards Gaia.
Okay, clear. Then let's have a look at the final video provocation. It's called The Caretaker, and we'll discuss it afterwards.
Good morning, Liam. Thank you for coming. I seem to have a slight problem with Joanna's hibernator. The cooler exhaust ports are indicating thermal runaways. Could you please investigate? Problem eliminated. Thank you, Liam. Have a nice day.
I think we had some technical issues and we lost Danielle for a bit. So Danielle, are you?
Yeah, but I can see everything, and I'm not sure if I wanted to see it because if I understand you correctly, we need to go into hibernation, correct?
Yeah, I guess the starting point was a probe from last year where the team suggested that if you think about healthcare from a Gaian perspective, actually you might sort of see humans as a species, as a sort of invasive species, or like almost as a disease, perhaps, because of the amount of impact that we have on ecosystems and on the environment. So they actually suggested this idea, like, what if you could give the planet a holiday? So what if you could give the planet a holiday away from human interference for a while, or at least a local ecosystem? So what if everyone could adopt a hibernation ritual, just like some animals do, to in times of like limited resources, like they basically go to sleep and they lower their metabolism so that they don't have to put a strain on the ecosystem, but also don't have to put a strain on themselves and actually save resources that way. And this team imagined a technology to be developed that would allow humans to do the same thing. So for 3 months a year, people would go to sleep as or like almost like in a sort of lowered metabolistic state, I guess, in sort of suspended animation. And the team this year reflected on that. Yeah, but also after seeing Corona, of course, because last year this seemed like a very far-fetched idea, like how and why would you stop society for 3 months? And now with the pandemic and sort of like self-isolation happening everywhere across the world, we actually saw what the impact of that could be. So it sort of gained new relevance. But the team this year also reflected on this idea of essential workers. So, who would get to sleep? What happens if things go wrong? It's probably unlikely that everyone will sort of like be sleeping. So you also still need some people awake to sort of take care of issues or carry out maintenance or things like that. And what would the life be like for this or that person? So how do sleep, health, and sort of the environment interplay and interact? I guess that's sort of the reflection that's going on in this film.
And Reon, how are you reading this? Putting a stop to society, is that a good solution?
I think that it is an interesting provocation from the fact of like giving nature a break, or giving a break, and sort of like this by going into hibernation. And like Frank has said, I think if you think of COVID, had the same impact, that we've kind of like given the environment a break by traveling less, by consuming less, by all of these things, and by consuming less oil, for example. But I would probably see this a little bit more towards the Habitania sustainability direction than to Gaia, for the reason that with Gaia, the spirit of Gaia really is to integrate as much as possible with nature, to use materials that are congruent with nature. And my worry would be, to have half of 9 billion people using that technology to go into hibernation, we inadvertently sort of like create a lot of like pollution just by the equipment that is needed for that. If you just sort of like reflect towards its logical consequences. So I think the idea of giving nature a break is fantastic. In terms of how can we do that, could we leverage, for example, people's homes, as we have done with COVID, to do that? That would make already sort of like a big difference. So I think there's a lot to reflect and to think about, and I think the students came up with a sort of like, it's a very provocative idea, but it's an idea that requires probably a lot of thinking and reflection to fit it into the bigger picture.
Yeah, but if I recalled correctly, the students of Design Academy first designed this hibernation idea also as not only giving nature a break, but also giving humans a break. For instance, if you are in your pregnancy or maternity leave, you could hibernate because it would, allow the kids to grow faster or to, take some time off when needed. So they actually presented it almost as a luxurious holiday. They even came up with a hibernation holiday. How did the students of ArtEZ respond to that, Frank?
Yeah, I guess we perhaps we both read into it like slightly different things. So in my opinion, I think they still presented it as a sort of a shared thing. In my opinion, like the sort of pregnancy thing was more like a logical conclusion, because if society would halt for 3 months a year, then what happens to if you need to give birth within those 3 years. So actually they looked at like how bears do it, for example, and they get like offspring like right after waking from hibernation, because it's biologically the most optimal time, because it means that you would have 9 months after that that would allow you to sort of bond, and sort of like raise your kids, I guess. So they sort of had this idea of like they developed this idea of preconception and anti-conception to be very specifically targeted, so that if you wanted to get pregnant, you would become pregnant at the optimal time, so that that could take place. But what I think they did really well last year was that they sort of one of the conclusions of that approach was actually that it would mean that everyone's birthday would be right after waking up from hibernation, which meant that it turned into a fest. Like the first week after waking up from hibernation would be a massive celebration, because everyone would be, and instead of celebrating a day, which wouldn't be as special, like people would celebrate a time of being born, which is I found a very interesting cultural spin on it, because it allows you to buy into this idea that sure, you can have the technology, but how do you get it adopted? And I guess this idea of sort of turning it into a cultural feast or a cultural induced holiday, I think is I found very clever last year. I guess this year it was much more to do with I think the team this year sort of let that go a little bit. And focus much more on the time in between. So, who is awake, who would be the invisible people, sort of like arranging it in the background. And I guess it plays into this idea what Reon was just mentioning, like, is all of this technology, worth it to sort of do this thing? But I think the core idea is still that, if you would give nature a break. You would do it like all at once, because then the effect would be the biggest. We saw it in COVID as well, like all of a sudden in places where usually there's smog, we could see the sky again, birds in cities start singing differently again. Skies, well, I already mentioned skies became clear, but like global pollution levels plummeted. But then, as soon as sort of all of these countries gradually got out of COVID again, we saw the spread sort of like gradually, gradiently taking over again as well. So it works best if everyone does it at once, and then if you could repeat that. So if you could really turn it into a tradition. But I completely agree with what Reon was saying before. Like, the question is, of course, like, do we need all the technology, or should we just sort of, make our homes a more comfortable place and sort of like allow us to sit in there 3 months a year, perhaps.
But
yeah.
I think it's a fascinating, also like the whole idea of like, with this pursuit of progress, we have progressed everything in the world much faster than nature can keep up. And I think, there's also increasingly there's like the slow movement, there's an increasing awareness that we have to slow down, we have to become more reflective. And for me, this hibernation idea is also that this idea of like, you have this sort of like cycles of like really sort of like slowing down and thinking better with nature, the human place better with nature. I think it's an interesting, it's a rich exploration. There's a lot that you can actually discuss around it, I think.
Yeah, it fits, I think, within the discussion of the new normal, right? If we should go back to a growth economy or design things differently.
Exactly. Yeah.
So perhaps a hibernation day would already be a good start again. Maybe also to round up this session, Reon, seeing all these provocations based on actually your framework, how do you feel these sort of tangible interactions can help to instigate these discussions? Because you designed this model years ago. I think you had many discussions already. Are these design provocations helpful in bringing that to a different level?
I think it's super helpful, because like a model by itself, the model doesn't say how it's going to be. It just indicates what are the directions and what are the beliefs behind those directions. And then you can actually have all kinds of sort of scenarios as to how this may pan out. And the moment you try to start to make it tangible, you run into very quickly into quite some difficulties. Like if we would scale this to like 9 billion people, how would it work? What would be the implications? And that is to a large extent been the problem with our material progress. Is we see a great idea, we create this sort of like narrow, agile and lean focus on the target that we want to reach, and we focus only on that, and we completely forget to reflect and be conscious as to sort of like, if this would really scale, what is the broader impact? And for me, if you create these stories and you create that as a discussion starting point, there's the space to sort of like reflect, but what if we scale this? So you can really sort of like think through what would be these consequences, and it prepares you for like possible changes that you have to think about in the way that you do things today. So I think it's pretty powerful.
Wow. And Frank, for you, because you've been working with Philips or with Reon for 3 years on these design provocations or probes, would you think this is also an interesting field for designers to dive into, to do more of these explorations in order to make these discussions more tangible or more apparent?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. I think, well, Philips, of course, has been extremely generous in supporting this type of research, especially because, as we said at the beginning as well, like there's a little bit of risk, of course, always that this gets interpreted as the vision of Philips, which is not at all the case. I mean, they're really explorations. But I think for me, the opportunities are twofold. So the first is, as Reon was saying, like the model gives direction. But as soon as you start to translate these things into tangible things, you quickly realize that as designers, we only have a very limited methodology. And our methodology is also largely still based on sort of like a Bauhaus legacy in a way, a very modernist approach, like where reductionist thinking is pretty much the key to sort of like all the underlying design methodologies that we can apply. So as soon as we start to work in sort of Gaia or in Etheria, so at the extremes of the model especially, you realize that all of a sudden your methodologies don't apply anymore in the same way. So by forcing these translations to become tangible, it also means that you, whilst doing these experiments, you're also trying to develop new methodologies or ways of thinking about it, or through making it, you have to sort of like, come up with new approaches that might be wider, might have wider application later on for other design teams. So that's like one of the things. The other thing is, I guess, that explorations like these can sort of provide these safe spaces, like Reon was saying also, where, I mean, we're not, because we don't have the intention to turn it into profitable products yet, you have the luxury of being able to sort of step back and think about, okay, well, we got to do this, we got to do our design activity, we got to sort of see where it could go, and now we can reflect, like, is this really something we want or not? Whereas usually as designers, especially if you're working in industry, the idea is that you create something and you bring it to market, and then the actual implications you'll see like a couple of years down the line, because it's very difficult to imagine beforehand like how things will play out in ways that you couldn't have predicted. So I think that's
actually designing for the consequences as well, right? Or
yeah, exactly.
at least, yeah.
Exactly.
What I also hear you mentioning is that by researching or by the design provocations itself, you start to rethink the model and also find new combinations within that. I think that's also what we tend to call what research through design can do. That's the designing and the reflection go hand in hand, but also help us to generate new ideas, new thinking. So, Reon, will these provocations also help you to create a new model, or maybe a revised one?
So I think we've done quite some exploration. And for me, still, because I've taken the model not from a technological perspective, the module is from a belief system perspective. And I think, the four trajectories, like they have a certain set of beliefs and memes that drives that forward. And then there are enabling technologies. And Frank said rightly that the streams does not limit what technology you can use. It will guide you how to apply it. And obviously, if you go towards Gaia, you should actually rethink some of the building blocks of technologies we have today that is not congruent with nature, and that is not something that can integrate easily into nature. So you have to rethink some of that. But for example, artificial intelligence and many of these technologies we are leveraging today, you can find very strong applications in any of these 4 trajectories. The thing is that to really sort of like, if one of these trajectories resonate with you, and I have to be honest, the Gaia is the one that has the strongest resonance with me. Probably that was obvious. Other people may find resonance in some of the other directions, but yeah. So I think it's a model for like reflecting how we would act and how we would act differently.
Yeah, I think it's very inspirational, and I really liked what you've done also in a very short amount of time. As you mentioned, Frank, this was 4 weeks with the students. So
it's a stunning achievement, Frank. I think for such a short time.
I should really hand on the compliments to my students. Like, I think they did an excellent job.
So we did it now. And I truly hope we, the 2 of you will continue working on this, and hopefully we can have a tangible physical discussion next year again at Dutch Design Week. Thanks again for sharing the great ideas and also having this discussion. I would actually like to conclude with a few comments on the comment section, because I get the impression that also the viewers of this session really liked it. I just phrased that Jens is mentioning, to create a future, we first need to envision it. So thanks for a good session. And Camilio is mentioning, design allows to show both future dreams and future fears. What a power to question ourselves, what we truly want. Well, I couldn't agree more. So thanks again. And hopefully we'll meet next year again.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you for joining.
Bye-bye.